Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is David Novak. Recently I have been reading The Early Chinese Empires by Mark Edward Lewis. And it's a book that at a previous time I tried to read. I got up as far as 162 or 63 and set it aside. I don't know how long ago it was that I tried to read it. I began the book with entire confidence in the author, having previously read Sanctioned Violence in Ancient China by Lewis. So it was not the fault of the writer, but at the time I remember just finding it very hard to assimilate a lot of the information. I don't expect on this second read through that I will retain everything or that I will remember everything, but now that I'm some 60 pages in, the reception of the work is entirely different to that very first time. On practically every page I am encountering a paragraph or two that has some kind of consonance with something else. I'm finding myself able to attach Lewis's ideas with other things that I have read. So, for example, and I've put some of these things into the community tab at YouTube. Years ago, as a lad, I picked up a mass market paperback of the James Ledger translation of the I Ching, and I remember reading in the introduction he talked about the great book burning. And in this book, Lewis talks about that in a little bit greater detail and suggests that while it is known as the great book burning, it was not a book burning in the sense that we would think of one, say, coming from Nazi Germany or something like that. And so as I am reading the book, I am just constantly thinking to myself, why was the first read through of this so, I don't know what the right word is, so impotent maybe, so unfruitful. And I think I am coming to some conclusions. One of the main things is simply that whenever it was that I read this book initially, and at some point Facebook will give me a reminder of what year that was, because I'm sure I posted some sort of an extract at Facebook. But I have no clue. But it was definitely before I set myself up to try to improve my reading. Now, improving my reading was not actually my goal. I think I wanted to increase my reading, but the improvement of my reading has been an unintended byproduct. I probably didn't think there was anything wrong with my reading. One of the things right off that I am doing with this book is that I am being very aggressive in looking things up. So if there's a region or something which he mentions and I'm not sure about it, having the iPad handy, I will just directly go and look it up. And this book unfortunately does not give anything in the original Chinese or what you might know as the kanji, which that's how people over here call it, the Chinese characters. And sometimes I feel that I need that. And I'm also not comfortable with pinyin. I've talked about my preference for the older system of transliteration, Wade Giles. And one of my viewers, Gentle Reader, I think has kind of convinced me that, well, instead of just bemoaning the fact ad nauseum, I think it's probably better for me just to try to learn the system. And so that is also something that I'm trying to do. So I'm trying to learn, when I see the XI or whatever the character is, which would have thrown me in the past, to try to understand what that refers back to as far as the Chinese. Now it's a complicated process, because when I learned what Mandarin Chinese that I learned, it was taught with Bopo Mofo, which is a phonetic system only used in Taiwan, I believe. A very useful system, but nobody else uses it. I think it's preferable to the pinyin, but it's not for me to say. So, for the past 3 years, since 2022, I have been making an effort to read harder. So I have a little logbook, and a fair number of the things that I read are history books. And so just in that little bit of time, just in terms of geographically, I think I am improving. But with reading this book, I am learning that qualitatively, I am beginning to see improvements as well. And so I've had some thoughts about that. So becoming a stronger reader, just for the sheer volume that I have been reading for the last 2.5 to 3 years, has made a significant impact. Also, the fact that I have other history books under my belt, so to speak, because since a lad, I was interested in history, but never made any real strong inroads into studying history or understanding history. And that not understanding history, I have to delve a little bit more into that, I think. Probably 30 years ago now. Again, I can't pinpoint dates with any accuracy. I was in the unabridged bookstore on Broadway and came across this book, Ancient History, Evidence and Models, and bought the book and read it. It's not an easy read, but Finley discusses how we know what we know about history, how we can know things about history, and it was very useful to me. And sometime thereafter, I was reading Bernard Lewis, and I came across this book, History, Remembered, Recovered, and Invented. And he very much talks about how the elements of history tend to get reconstituted depending upon the political exigencies of the day. And in fact, let me read you a little something from that, which I have bookmarked. It is perfectly natural and normal that the questions which an historian puts to the past are those suggested to him by the events of his own time, and much can be learned from the pursuit of such inquiry. What is improper is when the concerns of his own time suggest not only the questions, but also the answers. And Finley also is very much a proponent of talking about the specific questions that a historian is asking. The questions that we will ask are different to those asked by a historian of a previous generation. It's helpful to understand that. Finley also expresses that one cannot just rely on a historian to present his narrative as though it were the last word, because we are so much wiser than our forebears, and that somehow we can view the past without, say, ideological blinders on. Bias is ineradicable, And I would like to read a little bit from the conclusion of this book. He gives 4 main points in the epilogue. Number 1, the study of history, in which I include archaeology, is in no significant sense a science. That does not release the historian from the requirements of honesty in reporting, logical consistency in the analysis, and so on. But these are all secondary aspects of a scientific method without touching on the essential. 2, the historian's evidence, whether documents, literary texts, or objects, propounds no questions. Or, insofar as a literary text does ask questions, they are those of an individual author, not identical with those of anyone writing a historical account, that is to say, an analysis suitable to a later age. So, in other words, a historian writing now the history of the Peloponnesian War could not just take the conclusions of Thucydides verbatim or carte blanche. He could not ask the same questions that Thucydides was asking. Therefore, the historian himself must ask the right questions in the language of Droysen, quoted 2 or 3 times in my text, and provide the right conceptual context. He must do that consciously and systematically, abandoning the stultifying fiction that it is the duty of the historian to be self-effacing, to permit things to speak for themselves, in Ranke's words. Ranke, or R-A-N-K-E, was a big historian of the time when Finley was a student. I think the chapter devoted to him is called How It Really Was, a phrase from Ranke, and Finley deconstructs that and says this: a historian can't essentially tell you that. 3, the long tradition, normally not expressed overtly, but implied in the treatment, that sources written in Greek or Latin occupy a privileged status and are immune from the canons of judgment and criticism that are applied to all other documentation, is unwarranted and constitutes a major stumbling block to any proper historical analysis. One example is the touching faith in the oral tradition of the Greeks and Romans, which no one shares who has to deal with oral traditions in other societies, and which does not stand up to scrutiny the moment other evidence is available. Defective sources cannot be rescued by hard thinking alone, not even those written in the ancient classical language. 4, the first question to be asked of any written source are, the first questions to be asked of any written source are, why was it written? Why was it published? So that gives you a sense of where Finley is going with that. After I discovered his book, I really did not all of a sudden become a reader of history. I read a little bit here and there, very little, mainly concentrating my focus on ancient Greece, and then it was mainly books by Finley. I branched out a little bit, and then I also branched out into another direction from Finley, which was the history of slavery. And so eventually, long time after spending my time on Greece, I finally began to delve a little bit into classical Rome. So Keith Bradley was a historian of slavery there, and I read a little bit outside of that, but it took me a long time to get there. Just for the sake of show and tell, I thought historians do like to write books like those 2 which I just showed by Finley about history. They like to think about the activity in which they are engaged professionally. And I just thought I would show 2 others that I happen to have, but which I have not looked at. So I think a major help in my reading of Mark Edward Lewis's book this time is all of the history reading that I have done prior in the immediate recent past, so saying the last couple of years. A couple of years ago, I decided to read The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire by Gibbon. I learned on the channel of Steve Donahue that it exists in a Penguin copy, Penguin edition. There are 3 volumes of this size. And so I sought them out and decided to do it. And I was well familiar with the book over the years because nobody writes about ancient Rome or even ancient Greece. Nobody writes about antiquity in general without somewhere or other making a mention of Edward Gibbon's classic. Very frequently they begin with that mention. I believe Mary Beard's SPQR does. So I knew the book's stature. I did not know that it existed in a Penguin edition, so that prompted me to go ahead and set that as a reading goal. And I accomplished it, though I did most of the reading on my Kindle app. There are plenty of copies available. I was happy to have the hard copy at hand because sometimes the text that I was reading was a little bit garbled. It was not an easy read by any means, but I really had no prior conception of the Roman Empire. I didn't know. I'd seen the map, I'd seen the territory covered by Rome at its maximum, but I didn't understand how Constantinople fit in. I didn't understand the Holy Roman Empire, which was later and not part of the Roman Empire, not a continuation of the Roman Empire. I understood nothing. And Gibbon's book is so much broader than I ever expected. At parts, in fact, the whole Byzantine period, he talks much less about Byzantium than he does about what's happening in the Muslim world. And he talks about the Mongols and so forth. And so you get a much broader canvas than I ever expected. And then after that, I read something by Runciman about the Crusades, and here and there. Before that, I recently had read something about ancient Egypt and so on. But really that broad picture that Gibbon provided, even though on a page-to-page basis I couldn't understand it and I couldn't retain any of it, I think it helped me very much, not just in the sense of having the stamina, but having the mental fortitude for tackling other works of fiction. I have no geography, and so what I am finding to trouble me with the Lewis book, Mark Edward Lewis, I'm saying, was a problem with Gibbon. You have to know a good solid 10 rivers, not to mention mountains and so forth, and I'm still very shaky on all of that. Subsequent to that, reading a little bit into, as I say, the history of the Crusades, and then I ancient Iraq recently. My knowledge with some of these landmarks is a little better, but I still retain this stuff very poorly. But I am making the effort, and I believe even that little bit of retention that I had is helping me as I move forward. So with Lewis, I am aggressively trying to look up everything that I can, and it makes for a slow reading, and it calls to mind the debate sometimes that one hears on BookTube. Should one aim for speed, or is it good to read slow, and that kind of thing? And for something like this, I have learned that a slow reading is better. I think I initially tried to improve my reading for the sake of reading faster. But in my case, as a person who has no knowledge about the topic, it is important to go slow and make sure you are understanding what you are reading. Now, in my case, then, it's important that you start with a historian that you have a great deal of confidence in, because in the video that I did recently about 10 historians with impeccable writing, which I will put in the description box a link to, for me, reading a historian whose English was not so good, whose care was not according to some of the principles voiced by Moses Finley, it would be akin to driving a car down a pothole-laden street. It just would not work for me. So for me, it has always been of the utmost importance to have a historian who writes very well. And then other aspects to it, the bias or whatever, I can take into account. I can make amends for that kind of thing. One of these days I will read this book, The World, which I also saw on Steve Donahue's channel. He says it's a very good book. And I think that if one is going to try to read history, it is good to have something of an overview to begin with. And so in this, I am talking to somebody who is, like I was, 100% ignorant about history. It seemed to me that the thumb of history, the thumb of the past, weighs down on us regardless of whether we study it or not, or regardless of whether we know what contents make it up. And so I felt that it was better to understand. So when somebody tells me that such and such a thing happened in such and such a way, how much can I depend upon that assertion? And so it is good to have a little bit of familiarity with why we know things. A booktuber named Grix also has this book, and perhaps he and I will do a buddy read at some time. It looks very good, but it looks pretty Western-centric, and so that may keep me from it. It goes from early civilized life, ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, and then into Greece. But we'll see. Byzantium, Rome, the making of Europe. So ancient China is probably an afterthought in this book. So I really want a more balanced perspective. But even something like this would be a great place to start, because even in antiquity, none of these locations, none of these countries were in total isolation from one another. I read a little bit of an excerpt recently in that video where I talked about the excellent prose from Maurice Keene. And I think one of the things to be aware of going into the study of history is that there are no hard lines, or very few borders between, say, time periods. So let me read a little bit from that thing that I had read. History, it is said, is a seamless garment. It is nevertheless convenient to divide it into periods. Historians, though they no longer see, as the men of the Renaissance did, a clear break in the course of history when the last classical emperor in the West lost his throne in 476, still write about the Middle Ages. Most of them, however, find it hard to say when these ages began, let alone when they ended. Just where the limits are, in fact, drawn depends very much on the standpoint of the individual historian. I'll just leave that. The other video I have goes into more detail, and of course you can pick up this book. In later versions, I think it was the Penguin history of medieval Europe and so forth. And I first encountered writing of that sort in Finley in this book about the Bronze Age. And let me just read some of that, because it's very helpful to the novice to understand that all these words that come at you are makeshift. They're not indelible. And you want a historian who is very clear about that. So, in the study of man's early history, what is observed most clearly and readily is his technological progress. That is why it has been a long-standing convention to divide early history into broad periods according to the hard materials from which cutting tools and weapons were fashioned: stone, copper, bronze, iron, in that order. Then, as knowledge of the past increased, the long periods were subdivided in different ways. When it was noticed, for example, that in due course the technique of giving a sharp edge to flint and other stones normally changed from flaking to grinding, the Stone Age was divided into Old, Paleolithic, and New, Neolithic. Soon it became necessary to speak of Lower, Middle, and Upper, or Advanced Paleolithic, of an in-between Mesolithic period, of early and late bronze, and so on, and also to separate each age according to region or civilization. A shorthand was thus created, and its use persists despite a growing awareness of its inadequacy and even of its tendency to mislead. You actually will encounter many historians, popular historians, who are not aware of the tendency of these labels to mislead. So you want to be wary of that. So I suppose I should take it back to Lewis. I'm not sure that I have any great conclusions, but this has been my course in the study of history. For the first 10 years after discovering that book, I read all of Finley, but he more often than not talks about the writing of history, talks about the misconceptions of other historians and the difficulty of statistics in ancient history, that kind of thing. The incredible difficulty of pinning a precise value to the monetary figures that we have, which survive from another time period. And so that education really helped me along, but I never really plunged that hard into history itself as I am trying to do more now. This book is published by Harvard. I don't know why Harvard was not able to include the Chinese characters in their text, but I am making do, trying to accommodate myself to the pinyin. But it's a marvelous book as far as the writing goes. for me. And it's part of a 6-volume series edited by Timothy Brook, I think. Let's see what it says. The first 3 volumes, the first 3 volumes of which are written by Mark Edward Lewis, who, as I say, is an author that I like very much. So, although I only got to page 162, 163 the first time around, I am at least a third into that now, and given my track record over the last 2.5 years, I think there's a good chance that I will be making it through this book, and then after that I will make future decisions about the other volumes in this series. So, as typical for a desultory video of mine and the second take on a video that got interrupted, I'm not sure if I included all pertinent points that I had hoped to talk about. None of it was really assembled in my mind, but if you have any questions about it, again, a lot of people are intimidated by history, and I really don't think there is much to be intimidated about, but I think it's good to spend some time thinking about what you are trying to do with reading history. That's probably a good stopping point. So thank you very much for stopping by my channel.